Hi everyone, welcome back to our S6 history class. So last time we were talking about the German invasion of the USSR. Here I give you another rather epic excerpt from I suppose a comic that I found online. Today we're going to talk about the Battle of Stalingrad, and I hope that you like this comic. It, at the very least, although it's quite fantastic, like the other image that I showed you the other day. We know that it didn't really happen this way, that they never had a face-to-face, but it still conveys, the grand scale of this confrontation between the two great powers, Nazi Germany and the USSR. By the way, I'm sure you can find this online if you want to. Just as a quick review of what we've seen so far. You can see here this is a map of Germany and parts of Russia, and it shows you the multi-pronged advance, German advance, so multi-directional. They went in all directions, and along the way the Germans conquered important cities, and at a certain point they would threaten important centers like Leningrad, Moscow, and eventually Stalingrad in 42. Here on this slide, let me just give you an overview, a kind of timeline of the German advance leading up to the Battle of Stalingrad. So at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, like we said before, the Germans would see quick successes. They would take over important cities like Riga and Minsk. By the end of 1941, they take over other cities as well. So Smolensk, Kiev, and Kursk are captured. And like I just said, Leningrad and Moscow would be under attack. The German advance would stall because of the winter, and then once they pick up the action and they resume their advance, they would reach Stalingrad in 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad, as you can see here, it really is a matter of the Germans advancing further into USSR territory. The Russians would push back, but that would mean a toll of 500,000 casualties. And then at this point, Hitler would make the fateful decision of splitting up his forces. Some would concentrate on Stalingrad, and the rest would try to move southwards and take over those oil fields in the Caucasus. Okay. Now there's a question, of course, if Hitler decided to concentrate all his forces on Stalingrad, would that have meant victory for him? Now, you might ask, why Stalingrad? What's the importance of this particular Russian area, this city? Well, first, it was a major industrial center where trucks, tanks, and other things were produced. So you can imagine that if the Germans captured it, that would be a great victory for them and a big blow to the Russians. Perhaps more importantly, it was an important communication center. Okay, it was situated along the Volga River, which is an important transport artery. It is through the Volga River that certain things could be transported. So if the Germans captured this city, the rest of Russia would be cut off from the southern parts, which would also mean Russia would be cut off from their oil. Another important point is that Stalingrad is an important part of this route that allowed the Allies to supply Russia with food, equipment, and resources. So Stalingrad was part of this, was a transit point on the Persian corridor, which extends all the way to Iran, which was, by the way, invaded by the USSR and Great Britain, precisely to ensure that the Allies would be able to would have the supply route and continue to support the USSR in this manner. Now, when the Germans reached Stalingrad, of course, the Russians wouldn't take this lying down, so they offered fierce resistance. But the thing was, for the Germans, this was no longer a lightning war. This wasn't a blitzkrieg style kind of war. So fighting was intense. There was a lot of street fighting, house-to-house fighting, hand-to-hand fighting, and soldiers and commentators have also described this kind of war that happened in Stalingrad as closer or more similar to the type of combat or conflict that we saw in the First World War. Very little movement, very little advancement. Okay, essentially for quite some time a stalemate. But by late 1942, the Russians, led by Marshal Zhukov, pictured here, would launch a counterattack, and Zhukov would launch a pincer movement, meaning a two-pronged, two-directional movement from the north and the south. The south attacking the city, encircling some Germans. The Germans would then be outnumbered. They would be cut off from the rest. And so the situation would become dire for them. General Paulus of the Germans, pictured here, realizing the dire nature of the situation for the Germans, he would request to surrender. He would communicate this request to Hitler a couple of times, and Hitler would say, no, you have to stand your ground, fight to the bitter end. But then, seeing that it was entirely hopeless, they were surrounded, they were being shelled constantly by the Russians, General Paulus, at the beginning of 1943, had to relent and decided to surrender, directly disobeying the orders of Hitler. Why was this battle significant? It wasn't only because the Russians were finally able to stop the Germans in their tracks. It was also a symbolic victory. The defeat was catastrophic for the Germans, because finally, it rendered invalid, or it shattered the myth that the Germans were invincible. And in turn, this of course gave encouragement to the Russians. It boosted their morale, which, would encourage them, would spur them to counterattack. And in 1943, they would meet the Germans again at Kursk. And this would turn out to be a victory, a great victory for the Russians. And at this point, the Germans would start retreating, and the Russians would start advancing towards Germany with an eye to reaching and capturing Berlin. So you can add Stalingrad to a list of failures. The Germans failed to capture major cities like Leningrad and Moscow. They had to surrender at Stalingrad, totally outnumbered, encircled, short on equipment, and they were defeated and forced to turn back at Kursk, a major tank battle. Okay. Thanks, by the way, to the T-34, which some would argue was probably the best tank during World War II. The Battle of Kursk, July to August 1943, the Germans were defeated, although they thought they could take the initiative again, and they launched a counter-offensive, since after all, even though they were defeated at Stalingrad, the Germans still held quite a vast territory on Russian soil. But thanks largely to the T-34 and their superiority, the Russians' superiority in terms of the number of their aircraft, against the Germans were defeated quite decisively. Remember also, and I have to point this out, that one reason for this was, reason for the Germans being outnumbered in terms of aircraft. The Germans had to divert some of their planes to fight off the Allies, as the Allies started their bombing campaign of major German cities. And this will be the next topic that we will deal with in the following presentation. See you there.